The moment the Reed Sea closed behind them was the moment of change for Moses and his people. As told in the legendary Exodus account in Hebrew scripture, there was no going back. Freed from bondage in Egypt were they, but free to do what? Wander the desert, vulnerable and afraid? If you're not familiar with the story, here is a synopsis. The stories in the Old Testament are fantastic. Moses was born to Israelites in Egypt. Now we're talking about the tribe, not the country. That would come later. At the time, Pharaoh, the absolute ruler of Egypt, was fearful of the Israelites who had been living there for a few generations and had been quite prolific, and that he became afraid of them and of their number. So he put forth an edict that all newborn Israelite males be put to death. Moses' mother managed to hide his birth for 3 months, but was then forced to put him in a basket in a reedy embankment on the Nile that she knew Pharaoh's daughter frequented to bathe. Sure enough, Pharaoh's daughter found the baby and took him for her own and named him Moses. Pharaoh's daughter also hired a wet nurse, which unbeknownst to her was Moses' own mother. So Moses grew up well loved and cared for in the palace. He had a comfortable life until, as a young man, he witnessed the mistreatment of a fellow Israelite by an Egyptian labor boss. Moses lost his temper and he killed the Egyptian. Moses then fled palace life and became a shepherd in the desert hills far from the Nile Valley. One day near Mount Sinai, Moses encountered a bush that appeared to be burning. And out of that bush came the voice of God telling Moses he had been chosen to take his people, the Israelites, out of Egypt and deliver them to a bountiful land that they could call their own. Moses was petrified and sure that he had been mistaken for someone who could pull such a feat off. But God assured Moses that he would be enabled. So eventually Moses, convinced, proceeded to an audience with the Pharaoh to ask that he let Moses and his people leave Egypt. Right. Well, it took some convincing, and with God's help, 9 plagues were visited upon Pharaoh, his land and his people, even his animals, but he wouldn't relent. So God had to make the 10th plague an awful one. The firstborn males of Egyptians would die before the next morning. The Israelites were told to slaughter a lamb and smear blood over their doors so that the angel of death would pass over their houses that night. They were also told to prepare for departure. There was no time for letting the dough rise. The Israelites had to prepare unleavened bread for the journey. These, of course, are the elements of the future feasts of Passover, commemorating the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. The next morning, Pharaoh, having lost his own firstborn son, finally relented and let Moses and his people leave. But the avenging God of Israel was not through with Pharaoh yet, as God turned the heart of Pharaoh hard again, causing him to send a cavalry after the fleeing Israelites. This leads us to that Charlton Heston moment you might recall, when, as Moses, he raises his mighty staff and the waters part. And there is a dry path on the floor of this body of water that's been argued about for centuries by scholars. But they get across between two walls of water. And as soon as they are all safely on the other side, the water closes in again and their pursuers are foiled. This is the moment that water came rushing back, that their fate was sealed. It was the moment when everything changed for the Israelites. The rest of the story of wandering in the desert, the story of managing the aftermath and adapting to a new and foreign environment, the story of forging a new identity as covenanted monotheists, the story of 40 years of living in the wilderness, that, my friends, is a story of transition, big T transition. It is a story that you in this congregation share in, granted not nearly as dramatically, nor we hope as protractedly. Indeed, once the dry foot path across the sea disappeared under the water, nothing was going to be the same for the Israelites. However, they did have a promise of a new homeland, right? But with that promise came this cavernous uncertainty of how and when they would reach that place. The ending for Moses and his people was bondage in Egypt. The new beginning was freedom and the promised land. What had to be endured in between was a vast stretch of wilderness living. This is what modern day managers of institutional change recognize as transitional time, necessary transitional time. The change that throws us into transition is sudden and external to us. We didn't ask for it. It's something we almost always have little control over. But the transition time that follows is internal, either to the individual or the institution. It's the response to the change and how we are changed in the process, how we are transformed in the process. So let's look at this congregation's story of wilderness living, which, if you didn't realize it, you're just beginning it. Until last June, you enjoyed a spiritual leader whose ministry spanned 25 years. But like all good things, it had to come to an end. Harris retired. The Reverend Harris Reardon retired. That was this congregation's external change event. You had no control over her decision. For her, it was time. The end of her ministry immediately put everyone in an unfamiliar territory from which there was no returning to the old ways. Nothing will be the same for you going forward. And that can be really tough. But you have something to look forward to, and that's the prospect of calling a new minister. That will be a new beginning for you. But as with the Israelites, we all are faced with the uncertainty of what that process looks like. And the reality now is that you cannot go around it. You probably could, but you shouldn't go around it, but you must go through it. It's kind of like grief. If you don't go through it, you don't heal. You don't go through the necessary changes that makes you somebody that somebody can be in relationship with again. So this time in the wilderness, if done right, will be transformational for you individually and congregationally. This in-between time is absolutely necessary in preparing for a happy, good-fitting match between this congregation and a new minister. Now, in words, it sounds easy, but in reality, it'll be some of the hardest work that you do institutionally, especially in terms of togetherness, right? Because it's challenging for all of us individually. You're still grieving, in a sense. You've experienced loss, huge change. The old structures are not working anymore. Moses and his people living in the desert for 40 years is a perfect metaphor for transitional time. William Bridges is an international management consultant who uses the Exodus story in his model for managing change. He calls the transitional time between a change event and a new beginning the neutral zone. In other words, that stretch of time from the Reed Sea event to the crossing of the Jordan into the Promised Land was desert time, wilderness living that Bridges refers to as the neutral zone. But that's not to imply that nothing happens in the neutral zone. It's vitally important that transformation happens. Now, in the biblical account, the desert times were eventful. First, Moses is called up to Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments. That represented the Israelites' covenant with the God of Israel. But to Moses, or to Moses' people, his absence seemed long. They began to wonder not only where he was, but about whether he had the capacity to lead them out of the wilderness. Some even questioned his sanity. They were tired of the taste of quail and the blandness of bread made of manna. They observed passing caravans of other people and observed their happiness and comfort and joy. And some of those people abandoned Moses' camp and went another way. Some people were worried that they had angered the old gods, the polytheistic gods of the Canaanites and the Egyptians. So they went to Moses' second in command, Aaron, and asked him to do something. Aaron collected jewelry, melted it down, and cast a golden calf. How many of you have heard about the golden calf? All right. So about that time, Moses comes back, right? This is a covenant with one God. He is so angry that he's coming back with the tablets, and he slams them on the ground and they break apart. But I think that part of his anger too was the realization that his people were far from ready to enter the Promised Land, right? They didn't want to give up what they were familiar with. And they were worried that, once again, they were worried that they had offended the old gods. But they would have to learn how to embrace a new way of being through a covenanted relationship with the one God of Israel. The old ways of being had to die out. And this is the idea that's symbolized in the 40 years it took to get to the Jordan River, which was the entrance into the Promised Land that would become Israel. An entire generation, an entire way of being had to die off before Moses' people could be ready to enter into that new beginning. And remember, Moses himself died just shy of that new beginning. But don't worry, nobody here is going to die, at least not in service to this transformational time, I hope. It's just the former institution in you must give way to the new. And it's a process that takes time. Now, William Bridges, the modern day management consultant, acknowledges the confusion, the irritability, and the low productivity that people in and experiencing being thrown in this neutral zone, metaphorically into this wilderness, this desert time. And that's okay. That's perfectly understandable. Confusion, irritability, low productivity. Not only have you experienced a major change institutionally, but think about how COVID played out for you all as well, right? It's the same elements. So in a way, you're getting a double whammy here, right? So they're perfectly understandable. I've observed some of the frustrations, especially when it comes to getting something done and the old structures for doing them are not there because they no longer exist. And that's okay too. And if new structures fail to emerge, then perhaps it's something that we don't need to do anymore. But that's where the challenge, the difficulty, and the uncertainty come in, because we're not exactly sure what that looks like. Now, returning to the story of Moses and his people in desert times, after that golden calf incident, Moses had to trudge back up to Mount Sinai. He brought back new tablets, and this time with a specific command, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Wanted to be clear on that, right? But Moses also came back with a lot of detail about how to build a timeless religious institution through the creation of a movable temple that would be carried to and settled in the promised land. There was also Numbers and Leviticus full of how to be in this new relationship, right? In this new way of being religious, Torah law. It was incredibly detailed and concise. So in these desert times, they worked on all of this. It's the same for you all, really for us at UU Fellowship here in Boca Raton. Leaders will be proactive and reactive in making institutional changes. For example, the board's proactive transitional work is to review the bylaws to make sure that they continue to fit the needs of the institution. Now, a change that may come about concerning the meaning and definition of membership at UUFBR emerged in reaction to the need to have an accurate membership list. But the old structures for producing that list were no longer there. And so it was difficult. It was a difficult process, a difficult conversation. It may continue to be so, but please plan to attend next week's town hall meeting so that you can have input about that, right? It's an important subject. In the coming months, we will all be journeying metaphorically through a desert wilderness, through unfamiliar terrain, where our skills and how we do things don't always work for us. They don't work for us anymore. And where tensions sometimes run high and patience low, and where uncertainty challenges our faith every day, I encourage you to embrace those challenges. Embrace them with a mantra of all will be well. Remember that you could always have it worse. You could be wandering in the desert for 40 years. And we're trying to do this in 2. But practice that mantra of all will be well, and also loving kindness and compassion toward one another. You will get to the promised land, but in the meantime, be patient and allow yourselves to be transformed by the challenge of these desert times. You will be richly rewarded, I promise. May it be so.